A cold wind howled through the city streets, cutting through the layers of coats and scarves worn by hurried pedestrians. They moved quickly, heads down, focused on their destinations, barely noticing the man hunched against the brick wall of a bustling café. John Mitchell sat there, his back pressed against the cold stone, his rough hands wrapped around a small, steaming cup of coffee. The warmth seeped into his fingers, momentarily easing the numbness brought on by the biting chill. The cup had been handed to him by a passing stranger, a rare act of kindness in a world that mostly ignored him. To most, he was invisible, just another figure blending into the background, another homeless man tucked into the shadows of the city. But John had not always been this way. There was a time when his name carried weight, when his presence commanded attention and respect. Once, he had been Sergeant John Mitchell of the 80th Airborne Division, a decorated soldier who had led men into battle and fought for the very country that now passed him by without a second glance. The city had changed since those days, but the biggest change had been within him. He had seen things most could never imagine, experienced moments that had shaped him, broken him, and left him searching for purpose in a world that had moved on. Yet now, instead of recognition, he was being led to court, not for a crime, not for wrongdoing, but simply because he had sought shelter on a cold night in a place where he was no longer welcome. How had it come to this? How did a man who had once stood tall among heroes find himself accused of trespassing? And what was it that happened in that courtroom? Something so unexpected, so powerful, that it left everyone speechless. This is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this video. Stories like John's deserve to be heard. And as you listen, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in his shoes? Do you believe the system failed him? Or do you think there's more to the story? Comment below. Press number 1 if you believe he was failed by society, or number 2 if you think there's another side to consider. Let's talk about it. John Mitchell had once been Sergeant John Mitchell of the 80th Airborne Division, a soldier whose name had carried weight, whose presence had inspired confidence among his comrades. He had fought with unwavering courage, facing the horrors of war with the belief that his sacrifices meant something, that they were paving the way for a better world. But war had ended, and home was no longer the place he had once known. The transition was supposed to be simple. Return to civilian life, find a job, reconnect with loved ones, but nothing went as planned. His friends had moved on. His family, though once supportive, had grown distant, and the job he had been promised disappeared before he could even start. The structure he had thrived in was gone, and in its place was a world that didn't seem to have space for him anymore. John tried to adjust. He really did. He went to interviews, applied for work, but rejection after rejection took its toll. Employers saw a man who had spent too much time away, whose skills didn't seem to fit, whose haunted eyes spoke of battles fought in places they would never understand. And so, slowly but surely, he drifted, first from stability, then from friends, and eventually from any semblance of the life he had envisioned for himself. He carried the weight of his experiences with him. The nightmares never left, the memories resurfaced in unexpected moments, and the feeling of being lost became more overwhelming with each passing day. PTSD was not something he had chosen, but it clung to him, shaping his thoughts, clouding his mind, making even the simplest of tasks feel insurmountable. With no help, no resources, and nowhere to turn, he found himself on the streets, surviving day by day. Even then, John held onto his dignity. He never begged. He never asked for more than what he needed to get by. He became part of the background, just another forgotten figure on the city streets. He found small comforts where he could, a warm patch of sunlight on a cold morning, the familiar sound of traffic, the occasional act of kindness from a stranger. One such kindness came in the form of the café manager who, from time to time, would hand him leftover food. A simple gesture, but one that meant everything to a man who had so little. But kindness is often conditional. One cold evening, John sat outside the café, sipping on a cup of coffee that had been given to him earlier that day. The warmth seeped into his fingers, a brief comfort against the relentless chill. He wasn't bothering anyone, just existing in his usual quiet way, when the café manager stepped outside, her expression hesitant but firm. "I'm sorry, John," she said, shifting uncomfortably. "We've had complaints." John looked up at her, his tired eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, he understood. Someone had said something. Maybe a customer had felt uneasy at the sight of him sitting there. Maybe the owner had decided his presence wasn't good for business. Whatever the reason, the small kindness he had relied on was coming to an end. "I'll go," he said simply, gathering his few belongings. He wasn't one to argue. Years of discipline had taught him to follow orders without question. But before he could leave, a patrol car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, one with a look of resignation, the other with the firm resolve of someone who was just doing his job. "Sir, you can't stay here," the first officer said. His tone wasn't unkind, but there was no room for negotiation. John nodded, slinging his tattered bag over his shoulder. But as he turned to walk away, the second officer stopped him. "We've had multiple complaints," he said, glancing toward the cafe manager, who looked away. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." John froze. "Come with you?" His voice was quiet, almost confused. The officer sighed. "We're going to have to book you for trespassing." John didn't argue. What was there to say? This wasn't the first time he had been asked to leave somewhere, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, it wasn't just a request. This time, he was being taken in. As he sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out at the city that had long since forgotten him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: finality. He had no idea what awaited him at the station, but deep down, he wondered if it even mattered anymore. The officer stood with an air of authority, but there was no malice in his eyes. He had likely seen men like John before, lost souls trying to find a foothold in a world that had long since moved past them. "Sir, you can't stay here," the officer repeated, his voice firm but lacking harshness. John had learned long ago that arguing with authority never ended well. Years of military discipline had instilled in him an instinct to obey, to follow orders without question. So, without a word, he reached for his tattered bag, stuffing his few belongings inside and preparing to leave. He had been through this before. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him to move along, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But this time, something was different. Before he could take a step, the officer placed a hand on his arm, stopping him in place. "We've had complaints," he said, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. "I'm going to need you to come with me." John's heart sank. He wasn't just being asked to move. He was being taken in. For what? Sitting quietly with his cup of coffee, existing in a place where people no longer wanted to see him. The thought stung, but there was no point in resisting. He nodded silently, his expression unreadable, and allowed the officer to guide him toward the waiting patrol car. The ride to the station was quiet. John stared out the window, watching as the city lights blurred past him. He had once belonged to this world, once walked these streets with purpose. Now he was nothing more than a forgotten shadow, an inconvenience to be dealt with. At the precinct, he was processed quickly, photographed, fingerprinted, asked a series of standard questions by a young officer who barely looked old enough to have finished training. John answered each question with the same quiet resignation, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have any family to call?" the officer asked, looking up from the form in front of him. John hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. The truth was he didn't know. It had been years since he had spoken to his family, and even if they were still out there, he wasn't sure they'd want to hear from him now. He was led to a holding cell, the steel bars closing behind him with a hollow clang. The bench was cold, hard against his tired body, but John barely noticed. He had spent countless nights on concrete sidewalks, beneath overpasses, on park benches. This was no different. He leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, his mind drifting. He thought of his time in the service, of the men he had fought beside, of the promises they had made to one another. They had vowed to always have each other's backs, to never leave anyone behind. But war had ended, and life had taken them in different directions. Somewhere along the way, John had been left behind after all. A guard appeared at the bars, holding a clipboard. "Mitchell," he called out. John sat up, rubbing his eyes. "You've been assigned a court date," the guard continued, slipping a piece of paper through the bars. John took it, his fingers tracing over the printed words. He was due in court in 3 days. He nodded absently, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. Deep down, he wondered if it even mattered anymore. The courtroom was cold, the air thick with quiet murmurs and sidelong glances. John Mitchell stepped inside, his head low, his hands clasped in front of him as he shuffled toward the defendant's table. His mismatched jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and the scuffed shoes on his feet pinched uncomfortably with every step. He could feel the weight of the stares, the judgment in their eyes. To them, he was just another homeless man, another burden on a system too tired to care. As he sat down, he exhaled slowly, steeling himself for whatever was to come. He had long since given up expecting kindness in places like this. His world had been reduced to the harsh realities of survival, and courtrooms were not places where people like him found redemption. A few minutes passed before the door at the back of the room swung open. The judge entered, her black robe flowing behind her as she took her seat. She was a woman in her 50s, with an air of authority that commanded attention. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. She adjusted her glasses and began flipping through the files in front of her, reading through them with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen too many cases like this to be moved by any of them. John kept his head down, waiting for the inevitable recitation of his offenses. Trespassing, loitering, just another name on another docket. He had no defense, no excuses to give. He was simply tired. Then something changed. The judge paused, her brow furrowing slightly as she read through the file. She flipped back a page, then forward again, her lips pressing together. The murmurs in the courtroom faded as she lifted her head, her gaze landing squarely on him. "John Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying a different tone now. Softer, measured. John looked up, startled. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge leaned back in her chair, studying him more carefully now. There was something in her expression, something almost familiar. "Were you in the 80th Airborne Division?" she asked. John felt his heart pound against his ribs. His mouth went dry. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, slower this time. A hush fell over the room. The usual air of indifference cracked, giving way to curiosity. The judge closed the file in front of her and folded her hands together. "My brother served in that unit," she said after a moment. "He used to tell stories about a man who saved his life, a man named John Mitchell." John blinked. For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. The words sounded distant, foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The energy in the room shifted. The man they had dismissed as a nameless drifter was no longer just another case. He was a soldier, a hero. John's breath hitched in his throat. He had spent so long being unseen that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be recognized, to matter. The judge took a slow breath, glancing around the courtroom before turning back to him. "Stand up, Mr. Mitchell," she said. John hesitated, then pushed himself to his feet. He stood straighter than he had in years, his posture unconsciously falling into the stance he had once known so well. The judge nodded, her eyes holding something he hadn't seen in a long time: respect. "I think we need to talk about this case a little differently," she said. A hush settled over the room as the judge took a slow breath, steadying herself. The weight of the moment pressed against the silence, filling the air with something unspoken yet deeply felt. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, she spoke. "This man served our country with honor," she said, her words measured and firm. "And yet, here he stands, not because he has failed us, but because we have failed him." A ripple moved through the courtroom. The shift was almost palpable. The quiet murmurs of judgment that had filled the room earlier turned into hushed conversations of recognition. People who had dismissed John moments before now saw him differently. He was no longer just another homeless man before the court. He was a veteran, a man who had given years of his life in service to a nation that had let him slip through the cracks. John stood still, his breath uneven as he took in the change around him. The weight of years of loneliness, of invisibility, felt strangely lighter, though he hardly dared to believe it. He had spent so long being ignored, being looked past, that he wasn't sure how to react now that he was being seen. The judge turned her gaze back to John, her expression softer than before but still filled with authority. She cleared her throat before making her decision. "All charges against Mr. Mitchell are dismissed," she declared, her voice strong, carrying through the room. "Furthermore, I am ordering immediate assistance. He will not leave this courtroom without a plan in place for stable housing and support." For a moment, John couldn't move. The words seemed distant, like they belonged to someone else. Dismissed. He had expected a fine, perhaps community service, something to mark yet another failure, another reminder that he was an outsider. But this was different. This was hope, something he hadn't dared to hold onto for a long time. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring the sight of the faces around him. But he didn't care. He let them fall, not out of sorrow, but out of something deeper, gratitude, relief, the overwhelming sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't forgotten after all. A murmur of approval spread through the room. A man near the back, who had earlier avoided looking at John, now nodded respectfully. A woman wiped a tear from her eye. Even the court officers, so used to routine cases, seemed moved by what had unfolded before them. John's hands trembled at his sides as he tried to steady himself. He had walked into this courtroom expecting another blow, another reminder that the world had no place for him. Instead, he had been given something he had lost long ago, a second chance. As he turned to leave, escorted not in handcuffs but with dignity, he met the judge's gaze one last time. She gave him a small nod, one that spoke volumes. It was more than just a dismissal of charges. It was recognition, acknowledgement that he was worth more than the circumstances that had led him here. John stepped forward, unsure of what lay ahead but willing, for the first time in years, to believe that the future could hold something better. The first night in his new shelter, John lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The walls were plain, the room modest, but it was warm. It had been so long since he had slept somewhere without the chill biting at his bones. He turned on his side, listening to the quiet hum of the city beyond the window, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something close to hope. The judge had done more than dismiss his case. She had given him a path forward. She had connected him with a veterans outreach program, ensuring that he had a place to stay and access to counseling. It wasn't just about having a roof over his head. It was about finding stability, about learning how to navigate a world that had left him behind. The program was run by people who understood, people who had been where he was and had fought their way back. He wasn't alone anymore. John took his time adjusting. He attended counseling sessions, at first out of obligation, but later because they truly helped. He talked about things he had never spoken of before, about his time in the service, the loss, the fear, the weight of it all. And as he spoke, he found that the burden grew lighter. He wasn't the only one carrying these wounds. The other veterans in the program had their own stories, their own battles. They leaned on each other, offering support in ways no one else could understand. Slowly, he began to rebuild. The outreach program helped him with job training, something he hadn't thought possible. He learned new skills, rediscovered his strengths, and with each passing day, he felt more like himself again. The man he had been, the leader, the protector, the man who had once worn his uniform with pride, was still there. He had just been buried under years of hardship. One day, a counselor asked him if he would be interested in volunteering. The idea surprised him. He had spent so long feeling like a burden to the world. What did he have to offer? But the counselor simply smiled and said, "Your story matters. It could help someone else." So he did. He started small, sharing his experiences with younger veterans who were just beginning to navigate civilian life. He told them the truth about the struggles, the dark moments, but also about the hope, the help that was out there. He became a mentor, someone others could look up to, someone who had lived through the worst of it and come out on the other side. With each conversation, he found purpose again. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was making a difference. He had something to give, and that was more valuable than anything he had lost. Months passed, and John found himself walking through the city with a new sense of belonging. He passed places that had once felt hostile, streets where he had been told to move along, cafes where he had been an unwelcome presence. Now he walked with his head high, not as an outsider, but as a man with a place in the world. The transformation wasn't just about finding a home. It was about reclaiming his identity. He was more than his past, more than his struggles. He was a veteran, a mentor, a survivor. And for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. John walked past the cafe, where it had all begun. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air, mingling with the hum of conversation from the patrons inside. He had avoided this place for months, unsure of what he would feel when he saw it again. But today something was different. He was different. The manager, the same woman who had once called the police on him, happened to glance outside and saw him. Her face froze, guilt flashing in her eyes. She hesitated, as if debating whether to approach him, to say something, to make amends. But before she could decide, John simply smiled and gave her a small nod. Then he kept walking. He had moved past bitterness. He had found peace. Months later, John stood before a crowded auditorium, facing an audience of fellow veterans, community members, and supporters. His hands gripped the edges of the podium, not out of nervousness, but out of the sheer weight of the moment. He took a deep breath and began to speak, not just of his time in the military, but of everything that had come after. The night spent alone, the feeling of being forgotten, and the moment when everything changed because someone had chosen to see him. He spoke about the kindness of strangers, the judge who had recognized his name, and the chance he had been given to rebuild. His words carried through the room, touching hearts, stirring emotions, and inspiring many to take action. By the end of the year, John had a place of his own, a modest apartment, but one that he could call home. The walls were decorated with photographs from his service days, reminders of where he had been, and new tokens of hope for where he was going. A framed letter from the judge held a place of honor, a simple yet profound reminder that recognition and compassion could change the course of a life. As he sat by his window, a warm cup of coffee in his hands, he let himself dream of brighter days ahead. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt full of possibility. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer just surviving. He was living. If this story moved you, share it. There are many veterans like John who just need someone to see them. Let's spread awareness. Let's have a conversation. What can we do as a society to support our heroes better? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories. Because sometimes one moment of kindness can change a life.